it water with the sheep in the box?
I don't know if you've heard, but the Americans have concentration camps for refugee children. If you have heard that, no doubt you've also noticed a lot of hand-wringing over whether or not to call them concentration camps. Perhaps even from the American Holocaust Memorial people. If you dare to accurately refer to Trumpism, or even just some of the actions and decisions of the current administration, as fascist, well, you'd be better off talking to a brick border wall, rather than trying to convince anyone in the centre or the right, especially if you try to get them to care. So, let's try talking to a brick wall anyway, shall we? It's better than doing nothing. I refuse to be the person to stand idly by whilst atrocities are being carried out, and unfortunately donating what I can, which isn't much, to advocacy and legal interventionist groups, and informing people and or convincing them to look more closely at what's going on, is probably the most I can realistically do from the UK and with an extremely limited skill set. Yes, really. Fascism. I suppose I should probably justify this before we can really go any further in this video, since a lot of people will just scroll straight down to the comments and make this argument, and it's a kind of Godwin's law of political discourse. This idea that if you get into an argument on the internet about politics, eventually you will call your opponents or the opposition party or faction fascists. We can see this from the recent trend of right-wingers to equivocate the far left and far right, alt-left, both sides, etc. And of course there are those that go even further, and are happy to assert that Antifa are the real fascists. And these people are just simple identitarians who only want to preserve their culture and show pride in their race or some shit. So let's briefly go through why I believe that through Trump and his circle of bigots, the US is at the very least heading towards fascism, even if it's not already there, which it arguably is. First off, let's define fascism. As it turns out, that's easier said than done. See, unlike, say, communism or liberalism or conservatism, fascism has very little ideological cohesion, other than a few surface elements like extreme nationalism and a focus on a glorious past which has been humiliatingly taken by external forces, a reliance on and belief in genetic superiority and race science, and an othering of certain minorities in order to have a focus for the scapegoating. Robert Paxton, a professor emeritus of social science at Columbia University in New York, who is widely considered the father of fascism studies, defined fascism as a form of political practice distinctive to the 20th century that arouses popular enthusiasm by sophisticated propaganda techniques for an anti-liberal, anti-socialist, violently exclusionary, expansionist, nationalist agenda. Other definitions, Paxton said, rely too heavily on documents that Mussolini, Hitler and others produced before they came to power. Once in power, fascists did not always keep their early promises. Of course, the most famous fascists were the Nazis, so when people hear fascist, they naturally and logically hear Nazi, and I'm not gonna lie, there are certain similarities between Trump's America and Germany pre-Hitler, and I could go through just that for a while, but I doubt that would convince too many people, and I might end up coming off as a conspiracy theorist, so rather than doing that, I thought I might discuss fascism as it pertains to America specifically. I won't be explaining exactly how we got here, because that's a whole section later on in the video, and I don't want to front load this video with such a huge discussion, but it's coming, don't worry about that. To begin with, it is clear that there are very great differences, some of them easy to point out and not easy to explain away, between the regimes called fascist and those called democratic. Secondly, if fascist means in sympathy with Hitler, some of the accusations I have listed above are obviously very much more justified than others. Thirdly, even the people who recklessly fling the word fascist in every direction attach at any rate an emotional significance to it. By fascism, they mean, roughly speaking, something cruel, unscrupulous, arrogant, obscurantist, anti-liberal and anti-working class. Except for the relatively small number of fascist sympathisers, almost any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascist. That is about as near to a definition as this much abused word has come. But fascism is also a political and economic system. Why then cannot we have a clear and generally accepted definition of it? Alas, we shall not get one. Not yet, anyway. To say why would take too long, but basically it is because it is impossible to define fascism satisfactorily without making admissions which neither the fascists themselves nor the conservatives nor socialists of any colour are willing to make. All one can do for the moment is to use the word with a certain amount of circumspection and not, as is usually done, degrade it to the level of a swear word. So how do we go about doing this? Well, luckily for us, Umberto Eco, famous for codifying the concept of Ur-fascism, has a handy list for us to check a regime against. So let's try that then, shall we? 1. The cult of tradition. This is essentially an appeal to a nebulous better time in the past and an urge to return to or replicate this time. This one's pretty obvious, but in case you hadn't worked it out, Make America Great Again is a clear representation of this concept, as is the hand-wringing over Western values. 2. The rejection of modernism. As a natural progression from the cult of tradition, this implies that the reason for the moral degradation of society is simply that it has been eroded and corrupted by modern excesses and progress. This is pretty easy to demonstrate simply by all the times Donald Trump reminisces about how things were better in the old days.
Remember the old days when the doctors used to come to your house, right? Remember in the old days, cars, also made in the USA, right? You know, in the old days, we used to build bridges.
Families in the old days, they saved money.
In the good old days, law enforcement acted a lot quicker.
In the old days, when we were smart and strong.
You know, in the old days, we used to win.
In the old days, you put the hairspray on, it was good.
I think it would be nice if somebody put Merry Christmas on something,
Yeah.
you know, like the old days.
What happened to the old days where people came into this country? They worked and they worked and they worked and they had families and they paid taxes and they did all sorts of things.
Usually when he does this, it means something along the lines of better for straight white cis men, of course. 3. The cult of action for action's sake. Basically a method of dismantling trust in science and study in order to encourage a philosophy of unquestioning support for action, any action, without any intellectual reflection or even minor questioning. Trump is an extremely ignorant anti-science politician who has claimed that climate change is not real, vaccines cause autism, and that light bulbs and wind farms can cause cancer. 4. Disagreement is treason. This one is pretty self-explanatory, really. It establishes any resistance to the government as an act of treason, rather than merely a citizen exercising their freedom of speech. We can see this with Trump's constant and ridiculous attacks on the media who criticize him, most notably when he tweeted that he believes them to be enemies of the people, but of course his regime has also restricted access to journalists it deems to be critics, and Fox News and the like loves to accuse people on the left of treason.
Well, number one, the Times should never have done that, because really what they've done is virtually, you know, it's treason. You can call it a lot of things.
5. Fear of difference. Basically just bigotry in order to create a scapegoat, an enemy to other and mistreat, to stoke hatred amongst the fascist supporters. I don't think this requires much explanation. Trump has, over and over again, shown his outright bigotry towards basically any minority you can think of. 6. Appeal to a frustrated middle class. Fascists love to exploit class dynamics in order to achieve and maintain power. They will happily use economic pressures on those in the middle in order to both keep them afraid of being displaced by those below and confident that one day they might ascend to the upper echelons if they just remain loyal to the cause. They use the rhetoric of both capitalism and socialism despite completely believing in neither. Fascism as an economic system is a fascinating discussion, but not really relevant here since it only comes into effect when fascism has already been established. Trump gained a lot of support from middle-class Americans basically by lying to them, promising tax cuts and special treatment, like in the infamous 10% tax cut, for example. 7. Obsession with a plot. This is just institutional paranoia, believing that certain groups or opponents represent an incredible threat to the safety and or security of the state. This, coupled with the fear of difference point from earlier, is what causes the rampant bigotry inherent to most fascist societies, epitomized of course by the mistreatment of the Jews in Nazi Germany, as Hitler laid out in his book, which should really have been called The Ramblings of a Lunatic rather than My Struggle. The Nazis genuinely believed that the Jews were undermining Western civilization, which of course has carried through to today's neo-Nazis and common and garden fascists with the New World Order, globalists, George Soros and other nonsense conspiracy theories. Even ordinary conservatives like to refer to the liberal media or liberal universities indoctrinating people. The line between conservatism and fascism is paper thin in places. Additionally, Trump said multiple times on the campaign trail that he believed that Hillary Clinton was going to try and rig the election, even saying at one point that he would only believe the results of the election if they showed that he won.
It's a rigged system. The system is totally rigged and broken.
This system is rigged. We're competing in a rigged election. This is a rigged election.
That you will absolutely accept the result of this election.
I will look at it at the time. I'm not looking at anything now. I'll look at it at the time.
Are you saying you're not prepared now to commit
What
to
I'm
that
saying
principle?
is that I will tell you at the time. I'll keep you in suspense.
Will totally accept the results of this great and historic presidential election if I win.
8. Enemies which are at the same time too strong and too weak. Trump does this all the time. He believes in all these conspiracies to bring him down within the media and the Democratic Party, but also constantly brags about how much more powerful than his enemies he is. He's the classic schoolyard bully, using self-hatred and low self-esteem to make these enemies out to be a real threat, but also not a threat to someone as awesome as the Donald. But even ignoring Trump for a sec, how many times have you heard that the left are just a bunch of wimpy, effeminate soy boys and yet also control the world in some kind of sinister conspiracy? Right-wingers love to have it both ways. Fearmonger about the absurd power of cultural Marxism, but also caricature enemies as pajama boys easily defeated by the loyal American patriot. 9. Pacifism is trafficking with the enemy, because life is permanent warfare. Trump has shown himself to be an aggressive militaristic warmonger, at least in rhetoric. In practice, he's no more aggressive than any previous president, though that may change if he actually does go to war with Iran. From constantly shit-talking enemies on Twitter to boasting about being tough on refugees and crime, he's positioned himself as a strong leader, enthusiastic about the concept of conflict, even though when the opportunity came for him to participate in some, he dodged the draft, which one might find a little confusing coming from such an aggressive leader. 10. Contempt for the weak. Do I need to do anything more than play the clip of him mocking the disabled journalist at a rally?
Written by a nice reporter. Now the poor guy, you got to see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. I don't remember. He's going like, I don't remember. Oh, maybe that's what I said. This is 14 years ago. They didn't do a retraction.
That reporter he is talking about is Serge Kovaleski, who now works for the New York Times. As you can see right there, he suffers from a chronic condition that impairs movement of his arms. A Times spokesman says they find it outrageous that Trump would ridicule the man's appearance.
Trump has ultimate disdain for those he sees as beneath him. 11. Everybody is educated to become a hero. This is not a specifically Trumpian thing, however it appears, from here across the pond, that there is, and has been for a while, a huge emphasis on glorifying the US military, from recruiters taking advantage of vulnerable kids with few other options, to excessive propaganda in movies, just go watch that Pop Culture Detective video about it which outlines all the issues with this practice, to the simple fact that so much of the US's budget goes towards its military. And no, don't bring out any of that world police force shit. I'm not buying it, and neither is anyone else with a couple of brain cells to rub together. If the US was a police force, it might actually start cracking down on labour violations, or places like Saudi Arabia or North Korea, where dreadful human rights abuses are being carried out. 12. Machismo, which as a natural outgrowth of valuing such values and traditions as heroism, violence and action, leads to an intense toxic masculinity, and as a result, fascists hold both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. Do we need to look further than the Access Hollywood tape?
I moved on her, actually. You know, she was down in Palm Beach. I moved on her, and I failed. I'll admit it.
Whoa.
I did try and her. She was married.
It's huge news, Sarah.
No, Nancy. Yeah. No, this was marriages. And I moved on her very heavily. In fact, I took her out furniture shopping. I moved on her like a bitch, but I couldn't get there. And she was married. And all of a sudden, I see her. She's now got the big phony tits and everything. She's totally changed her look. I gotta use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just like, I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. I can do anything.
Even if we did, Trump has gone on record attempting to deflect sexual assault accusations by saying that the accusers were too ugly for him to rape, and has a history of chauvinism, transphobia, with the military ban for example, and homophobia. He wouldn't have made Mike Pence his VP if he found those ideas intolerable. 13. Selective populism. The belief that the people, as a central monolith, have a common will, distinct from and superior to the viewpoint of any individual. As no mass of people can ever be truly unanimous, the leader holds himself out as the interpreter of the popular will, though truly he dictates it. Fascists use this concept to delegitimize democratic institutions they accuse of no longer representing the voice of the people. Trump constantly goes on about his belief that the people love him, want him to stay in office for more than 2 terms, would follow him even if he shot someone, etc. He's more than happy to start talking about his supporters as if they make up the people. 14. NEWSPEAK. Fascism employs and promotes an impoverished vocabulary in order to limit critical reasoning. This is possibly Trump's most infamous tactic. From fake news to alt-left to alternative facts, he's a big fan of using these non-words and phrases to obscure what he really means. So that's Echo's fascism covered, but are there any other alternative interpretations? Perhaps some kind of list of warning signs that might indicate a rise of fascist ideology? The Holocaust Museum has us covered there. How many of these can you see that are represented in modern American society and or government? Before I go into this sad state of affairs, I thought I'd go full pretension and quote some poetry, you know, to lighten the mood a little. I sometimes fear that people think that fascism arrives in fancy dress, worn by grotesques and monsters, as played out in endless reruns of the Nazis. Fascism arrives as your friend. It will restore your honour, make you feel proud, protect your house, give you a job, clean up the neighbourhood, remind you of how great you once were, clear out the venal and the corrupt, remove anything you feel is unlike you. It doesn't walk in saying, our programme means militias, mass imprisonments, transportations, war and persecution. Yes, that was from that Michael Rosen from all the ancient memes.
The Michael Rosen Rhapsody. Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Caught in windmill. No, escape from the Skyfoogle.
See, fascism is a slow burn. It doesn't just come up suddenly and surprise you. If it did, people would immediately recognise it for what it is and reject it, which for a totalitarian system is not an ideal situation to be in. So in order to fully guarantee the support of the people, any kind of fascistic system has to boil the population like a frog. It may take years or even decades, and a lot of the time it doesn't even start out as something deliberate. As we went over previously, a lot of the hallmarks of fascism were already a part of American culture. The extreme nationalism and flag worship is, for those of us in Europe, an eerily fascistic tendency, and the extremely common image of a classroom full of kids pledging allegiance to a flag with their hands placed firmly over their hearts is disturbing. But I don't want to rehash the first section of this video, so suffice to say that Americans' intense belief in their own national superiority, exceptionalism, is easy for a smart person or group of people to manipulate and twist into racism and xenophobia. After all, if Americans are the best, most loyal people, then it follows that non-Americans are in some way inferior, right? And the US's fetishization of its military has been a part of its culture for decades now. Look, the point is that over time, more and more of Echo's checklist of what makes an fascist state have been building up and getting more and more extreme and overt over time.
USA! USA! Knock the crap out of him, would you? Seriously. Get him out of here. In the good old days, this doesn't happen because they used to treat them very, very rough. And when they protested once, you know, they would not do it again so easily. I'd like to punch him in the face, I'll tell you. I love the old days. You know what they used to do to guys like that when they were in a place like this? They'd be carried out on a stretcher, folks. That's true.
Next time we see him, we might have to kill him.
In the good old days, they'd rip him out of that seat so fast. Shut up! Shut the hell up! No, I would not shut the hell up. Get the fuck out of here, man. Hey, go, mate. Get out of here. In the good old days, law enforcement acted a lot quicker than this. A lot quicker. And we're going to enforce the law, and Americans should remember that if we're going to have law. I am the law and order candidate.